The Stanford prison experiment was worse than you think. In August 1971, a psychology professor turned a university basement into a prison. Within 36 hours, guards were forcing prisoners to clean toilets with their bare hands. By day 5, the experiment had spiraled so completely out of control that one prisoner was showing signs of severe psychological disturbance, and the whole thing had to be shut down early. You've probably heard about the Stanford prison experiment. It's in every psychology textbook, cited in thousands of studies, used to explain everything from Abu Ghraib to toxic workplace cultures. But here's what they don't tell you in those textbooks. Almost everything you think you know about this experiment is wrong. And the truth? It's so much worse. Let me paint you the picture of what actually happened, because the real story has been buried under decades of myth-making and academic reputation management. Philip Zimbardo, a young psychology professor at Stanford, wanted to understand the psychology of imprisonment. The official story goes that he recruited normal, healthy college students, randomly assigned them to be either guards or prisoners, and then just observed what happened naturally. The guards became sadistic. The prisoners became submissive. Human nature revealed itself in all its darkness. Except that's not what happened at all. Here's the first thing that should make you suspicious. Zimbardo didn't just observe this experiment. He cast himself as the prison superintendent. He wasn't a scientist watching from behind one-way glass. He was an active participant, living in the basement with his subjects, making decisions about punishment, deciding when prisoners could use the bathroom. Think about that for a second. Imagine a scientist studying the effects of a new drug, but instead of observing, they're in the room telling patients how to feel, suggesting side effects, coaching their responses. That's not science. That's theater. But it gets stranger. One of Zimbardo's research assistants, a graduate student named David Jaffe, played the role of the warden. And here's where things start to unravel. Jaffe later admitted that he specifically instructed the guards on how to be psychologically oppressive. He gave them ideas. He showed them tactics. The guards weren't spontaneously becoming cruel. They were being directed. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but the guards still chose to follow those instructions, right? That still tells us something about human nature. And that's exactly what Zimbardo wanted you to think. But let's dig into what was really happening in that basement. The prisoners weren't random college students who all reacted the same way. In fact, most of them didn't react the way the experiment claims at all. When psychologist Thibault Letixier went through Zimbardo's archives, he found something shocking. The vast majority of guards refused to act cruelly. They were friendly, even helpful. Some actively resisted Zimbardo's instructions to be tougher. The abuse that did happen, it was concentrated in the actions of just a few guards. And even they weren't acting spontaneously. Let me tell you about one guard in particular, the one who became the face of the experiment's findings. His name was Dave Eshelman, and he's the one you see in all the footage wearing reflective sunglasses, speaking in a slow southern drawl, psychologically tormenting the prisoners. Years later, Eshelman admitted something stunning. He was acting. Specifically, he based his character on a sadistic prison guard from the movie Cool Hand Luke. He thought the experiment was boring, so he decided to create something interesting. He literally told researchers he was just trying to help Zimbardo get good results. This wasn't an organic descent into tyranny. It was improv theater with undergraduate actors who thought they were helping their professor prove a point. But here's what makes this truly disturbing. Zimbardo knew. He had to have known. He was there watching everything, directing the action, and he said nothing. The most famous moment from the Stanford prison experiment is when prisoner 8612, a young man named Douglas Corpy, had what appeared to be a complete psychological breakdown. The video footage is haunting. Corpy screaming, demanding to be released, appearing to lose his grip on reality. This moment became the emotional centerpiece of Zimbardo's claims about the experiment's power. Here was proof, he said, that the situation had become so psychologically damaging that a healthy young man had been pushed to the edge of sanity in just days. There's only one problem. Corpy was faking it. In 2017, writer Ben Blum tracked down Douglas Corpy and interviewed him about what really happened. And Corpy's explanation changes everything. Corpy was a graduate student who had planned to use his time in the prison to study for his comprehensive exams. But when the guards took his books away, he realized he was wasting valuable study time. So he decided to fake a breakdown to get released early. "I took acting classes," Corpy explained. "I mean, there's no question I was acting. I'm me. I'm not a prisoner. I created a story. I created that breakdown." When Corpy saw how Zimbardo used his performance in presentations and documentaries, he was shocked. He tried to tell people the truth, but nobody wanted to listen. The myth was too powerful. The story was too good. And Zimbardo? He continued to use that footage for decades, never mentioning that his star piece of evidence was a performance. At this point, you're probably wondering how this became one of the most famous experiments in psychology if it was essentially a fraud. The answer reveals something deeply unsettling about how science actually works. After the experiment ended, Zimbardo faced a problem. He had preliminary data, anecdotal observations, theatrical performances, but nothing that resembled rigorous scientific findings. Most of his participants had behaved normally. The abuse was limited and coached. The famous breakdown was fake. So what did he do? He started telling a story. Zimbardo became brilliant at presenting the Stanford prison experiment not as flawed research, but as a profound revelation about human nature. He wrote compellingly. He spoke passionately. He showed the dramatic footage. He framed the whole thing as a cautionary tale about the power of situations to corrupt good people. And people wanted to believe it. In the wake of Vietnam, Watergate, and growing concerns about institutional authority, Zimbardo's narrative fit perfectly. It told us that nice people could do terrible things if placed in bad situations. It absolved individual responsibility while condemning systems. The experiment was never properly peer-reviewed. Zimbardo never published his full data in a scientific journal. When other researchers asked to see his complete records, he refused for decades. But none of that mattered because the story was too compelling. Psychology textbooks repeated it. Documentary filmmakers celebrated it. Corporate trainers used it. It became common knowledge. Here's what's truly chilling. When researchers finally gained access to Zimbardo's complete archives in the 2000s, they found recordings of him and his team actively coaching guards to be more aggressive, evidence of prisoners being denied the right to leave despite requesting it, and documentation showing that Zimbardo was more concerned with creating dramatic footage than collecting scientific data. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking. Okay, so one famous experiment was flawed. Why does this matter decades later? It matters because the Stanford prison experiment has been used to justify real-world policies and explain real-world atrocities. After the Abu Ghraib prison abuse scandal in 2004, when photos emerged of U.S. soldiers torturing Iraqi detainees, Philip Zimbardo was called as an expert witness in the defense of one of the guards. His argument? The situation made them do it. The power of the prison environment corrupted otherwise good people, just like in his experiment. But if the experiment was manipulated, if the guards were coached, if the breakdowns were performed, then that entire argument collapses. Individual responsibility matters. Choices matter. Character matters. The Stanford prison experiment has also been used to argue that reforming institutions is more important than holding individuals accountable, that environments determine behavior more than personal ethics, that we're all just products of our circumstances. These aren't academic questions. They shape how we think about criminal justice, corporate responsibility, military conduct, and moral accountability. And they're built on a foundation of manipulated data and theatrical performances that were passed off as science. So, if the Stanford prison experiment doesn't tell us what we thought it did, what can we actually learn from this story? The real lesson isn't about how situations corrupt people. It's about how badly we want to believe in simple explanations for complex human behavior. We want to believe that good people turn evil because of their environment, because that's scarier and more interesting than the truth, that most people, even in bad situations, remain decent, that cruelty usually requires active encouragement, that breakdowns are rare, that human nature is more resilient than we think. But resilience doesn't make for dramatic documentaries. Ordinary decency doesn't get cited in thousands of papers. The truth that most of Zimbardo's guards refused to be cruel, that most prisoners coped reasonably well, that the whole thing was more boring than barbaric until he started directing the action, that's not the kind of revelation that launches careers or sells books. There's another lesson here about how we evaluate scientific claims. The Stanford prison experiment should have been scrutinized more carefully from the beginning. The lack of peer review, the absence of published data, the researcher's deep involvement in the experiment, his refusal to share complete records. These were all red flags that the academic community largely ignored. Why? Because the story confirmed what people already believed about authority, conformity, and human nature. It was politically useful. It was emotionally resonant. It was narratively satisfying. We let our desire for a good story override our commitment to good science. Philip Zimbardo is still alive. He's in his 90s now. And to this day, despite decades of evidence showing the fundamental flaws in his famous experiment, he defends it. He argues that the criticisms are overblown, that the core findings remain valid, that the experiment revealed important truths. Maybe he genuinely believes that. Or maybe, after spending 50 years building a reputation on a flawed study, it's too late to admit the truth. But here's what we know for certain. The Stanford prison experiment wasn't a neutral observation of human nature revealing itself. It was a scripted performance, manipulated by a researcher who became so invested in proving his hypothesis that he stopped being a scientist and became a director, coaching his actors, editing the footage, controlling the narrative. The real Stanford prison experiment, the one that actually happened, not the myth we've been told, shows us something more subtle and more important than the original story. That creating evil requires work. That most people resist. That human decency is more robust than we fear. And maybe that's the revelation we needed all along. Not that we're all monsters waiting for the right circumstances, but that we're mostly decent people who can be manipulated, by those telling us compelling stories about who we are. The question is, what other stories are we believing without looking at the evidence? Want more mind-blowing psychology? Why your memories are mostly fake, the next video. Subscribe for weekly dark psychology, full psychology secrets playlist. This is just the beginning. Subscribe. Next, how your brain deletes 90% of your day. Read the actual declassified documents. Vote which experiment was most unethical.